How many of us, if I were to ask you, would be familiar with data centers? Why we have them, what they actually do, and what impact they have on society? I would argue that not many of us do, and I would also suggest that because we don't know a lot about them, we're susceptible to the potential fear-mongering by those who have chosen to oppose data centers for whatever reason. I don't want to get into what the reasons may be. Let's assume that many of them are pure. But when somebody takes to the social media airwaves or to the news or in our private conversation, things like showing a flyer with 23 atomic bombs going off and saying that a data center will generate the same amount of heat, or has a picture of an alpine forest in Utah and then lays over the top of that two cities the size of Manhattan. Or if, for example, somebody decides to suggest that having a data center will dry up the Great Salt Lake. Those aren't things that I feel would be statements that are made from individuals that have anything other than the intention of stirring emotion and creating a sense that these are something that will absolutely destroy our future and we need to stop them today. What I'd like to do is get into some of those specific topics with you. Suggest that I'm only an expert in that I've been involved with the data center industry for a period of time that allows me to share with you some things that the general public might not know. I want to begin by saying that when I go to the conferences, it's almost like going to an episode of The Big Bang Theory, for those of you that are familiar with that series, where Sheldon Cooper is walking around in multiple personalities and suggesting fun things for the industry in the advancement, but lacking the personality skill to be able to share with the world what that technology is in a way that helps us understand not only the need, but that we are moving towards a time where these centers are less threatening than what they have been historically. And the thing that's interesting about that is that I feel a lot of the information that is shared today is from data centers of the past. And perhaps those were some of the dinosaurs of the early years of what data centers are today. But it's almost like any innovation that we've seen. The automobile, for example, if we brought forward some of the first versions, they wouldn't be acceptable in our world today for both their fuel efficiency and the emissions that they create. And we'd have other examples, of course, but today we live in a world where that technology allows us to advance in a way that it betters our environment, betters our community, and allows us to have the niceties of what that offers. For me, advancement in technology is something that perhaps throughout history has bumped into some adversity. My great-grandmother, as a child, read a book by candlelight. And you can imagine back in her time that perhaps some were pushing back against the advent of electricity. Some later pushed against the locomotive. Some pushed against the automobile. Some pushed against airline travel. And there would be other industries and examples that we could give, but it's not unusual for us to fear something that's new and innovative because in part of that fear, there's a lack of understanding. And so I want to address some of the things that people are pushing out in the media today that perhaps will at least give us some insight to what is happening in data center technology today and relate it to some other things that we enjoy as a society. But then if you're not bored to tears and can stay with me to the end, I'll share with you why I think data centers are important and how they operate. Part of the reason I want to do this longer version of a video is that I did a series of short videos on TikTok, and I'm new to TikTok. I wanted to see what the reaction might be. I was pleasantly surprised. There was a lot of positivity, and certainly there's those people that criticize me for not having eyebrows, for having a stupid pink keyboard, and the typical thing where the public is just cruel and evil. But there was a lot of positivity, and you have to know that TikTok, I'm an influencer there, as you can imagine. I have 67, and as my grandchildren would say, 6'7", Grandpa. It's insignificant, but it with me having no experience on TikTok and very little following, it still got an attraction that was interesting to me. So let's talk about the things. Let's first talk about the heat that's generated. I've seen in the media a picture of atom bombs going off, and the suggestion by a Utah State professor, I believe, suggesting that the Kevin O'Leary project in Box Elder County, Utah, would have the equivalent heat island of 23 atomic bombs going off. And what's fascinating to me is that there's a lot of things in society that we could take over a lifespan and condense them into a single moment and suggest to the world that the heat generated from that facility would be extraordinary. But if you step back and say to yourself, why would he use atomic bombs? Well, he certainly has an agenda there. And to condense it to a single time frame rather than what would transpire over the life of the project, he has an agenda that is obviously oriented towards persuading the public to be against these facilities. So let's talk about the heat to start. On a 200 megawatt facility that I'm building, the heat island that's generated from that will be about 3.6 degrees. And when you say a heat island is actually the area around the facility, and it is an average that is taken for that area, and then it dissipates pretty quickly. And so if I were to pick something that is part of our everyday that would be a comparison, I'd go to a shopping area. They used to be called malls, and we still have some malls, I guess, but let's go to a retail shopping area. And let's think for a minute about us pulling up to that area and seeing the vast parking lot of typically black asphalt. And then imagine what that heat temperature is coming off the asphalt, which for those that don't know is between 140 and 180 degrees. And that heat that radiates up into the atmosphere is certainly a heat island. But now envision us pulling up in our automobiles at what I would say is a 250 degree engine, some hotter, that is under the hoods of our cars. And as you pull up, we know that engine block is very, very hot and would take some time to dissipate. The car itself, oftentimes our dark paint colored cars are too hot to touch. But then let's think about the building, its rooftop, the air conditioning that's climatizing that shopping area, and the heat that's putting off. Well, a typical shopping center area has a heat island, and that heat island is about 2 times the heat of a data center. Data center 3.6, shopping area 6 to 8 degrees. Did we know that? Do we understand that? But let's expand that further, because we have highways, roadways, parking lots all throughout our communities. We have rooftops. How many of you, raise your hand, have black or dark roofs? We all have air conditioning. We have different things in our everyday life that contribute to these heat islands, which would include other large manufacturing or warehouse areas like a data center, which would be like the Amazon Prime warehouse, warehouses for other types of needs, groceries, other things that we have and use every day, trades, supplies for housing, you just name it, they exist. And what happens in our communities, that heat island actually in our more dense areas is within that city limit, oftentimes reaching as high as 10 degrees, and then dissipates as you get further away from the city. So our life actually has these heat islands already, and we could take from my example here and pick any one of them and attach a story about atom bombs going off if we wanted to fearmonger people into no longer having shopping areas, retail areas, entertainment and recreation areas, homes, offices for where we work, you just name it. I mean, life in the modern day has a lot of things that we enjoy and have become accustomed to that generate these heat islands. And so understand that while a data center puts off heat, it is not worse than anything that exists in our modern day that we tolerate. Second thing, water. I've heard that people have been saying that the water that will be used in the data center will dry up the Great Salt Lake, the Kevin O'Leary project. But water is a concern in other data center areas as well. Utah happens to be an arid climate, and water is very sacred to us. But if we go back, let's just say a decade, and think about some of the data centers that were used here in Utah. We have NSA. It's a 65 megawatt facility that was built in the era where we had extensive evaporative cooling, and it used a great deal of water. And in fact, when that facility was being built, I remember the astonishment of many of the people that I knew or know that were amazed at how much water it would use. But if you went to those facilities and looked at that evaporative process, you could see why it needed volumes of water. But let's talk about where technology has gone today in relation to the data centers and the need for water. If we have evaporative cooling and we can have a liquid cooling, the efficiency in that is 3,000% improvement, 30 times better. So think of yourself as an individual. If you went outside and it was 50 degrees, you could tolerate that. And over time, you'd get colder and want some clothing. And then eventually, if you didn't warm yourself with clothing or come back inside, it could lead to hypothermia, perhaps. Let's reverse that. Let's go somewhere where it's 185 degrees. For me, that's a sauna. Sometimes you can walk into a sauna that's 185 degrees and feel it's a little bit cool initially. But the longer you stay, the more intense it feels, and you honestly can't stay there because your body reacts to it in a way that increases your heart rate, and you eventually have to go. Some tolerate it longer, but somebody that's new to going into a sauna, you can't tolerate very much. But in both of those environments, like what evaporative cooling does with the air molecules, is that we can tolerate it. It isn't effective immediately or efficiently. So liquid cooling, on the other hand, now picture yourself going into a cold plunge, 50 degrees. I like cold plunging, but 50 degrees, let's say you can go in there for 3 minutes. Some people can't tolerate it, some can go in longer. But you feel that immediately, and some will lose their breath at 50 degrees. Let's go the other direction, 185 degrees water. You can't tolerate that at all. That is something that would absolutely destroy the human body. So if that thermodynamic is advantageous, the industry went that way and is using it, the efficiency has improved incredibly. So today we have in data centers an opportunity to use a closed loop system. Oftentimes it'll have glycol in it, but that water that's in that system needs to be initially charged, and then is like our radiators where we put a little bit of water in, an older system, some leaks, newer systems, maybe some evaporation. But an example in that 200 megawatt facility would be that you'd need about 4 million gallons of water to put into that to initially fill it. And then annually, you might need as much as 20,000 gallons. Well, what's 4 million gallons? That's like filling 4 of our swimming pools in recreation areas. I would call them Olympic-sized swimming pools. They're larger than those that are in our homes. But let's pick something else. Oftentimes, a data center is in a rural area, and in those rural areas, it's been farmed, and a data center goes in its place. And it's those water shares that the data center is using to initially charge that system. If we were to grow alfalfa in the state of Utah for a season, that same amount of water to fill the data center would water for one season 2.5 acres of alfalfa. Now think about that for a minute. How many data centers are on 2.5 acres? They take a lot more acreage than that. It's often on farm ground. So what I would suggest to you is that if you looked at this fairly, you would say a data center is actually conserving water, not wasting water. So that if that had been farmed and you preserved that use, then we have more water that can go into the system, into the rivers, streams, and lakes. So a data center is actually conserving water. That's going from the evaporative cooling to the liquid cooling, and they're actually working on a cooling now too that's called dielectric, where the liquid can actually touch the chips. That fluid doesn't conduct electricity, and that has even a greater efficiency. So these Sheldon Coopers of the world are continually improving the amount of lowering the amount of resources that we need for these data centers, but at the same time, they're improving the technology. So that fear-mongering may have been valid from a decade ago, and I'm just picking a number. It could have been earlier than that. But modern technology is allowing us to be conscientious about that and not being those water users that we had been in the past. And frankly, it's not something that we should fear today. So heat, water. Let's talk about real estate. Let's talk about the maps that people use that are against the Box Elder Utah project. They'll picture an alpine forest, and then they'll put on top of that Manhattan times 2. So you see this alpine forest, and then you see the city on top, and you think, boy, you just ruined 62 square miles of Utah, 41,200 acres. Well, absolutely not true. Fact is that a data center at full capacity, if O'Leary were to build 10 megawatts, would probably occupy at the most 10% of the land, so 4,100 acres. But in my opinion, they'd probably be around 3,000, 3,500 acres that they would use on that piece of ground. So why do they need the 41,200 acres? Well, it's not to build 2 cities and to ruin an alpine forest, because if you Google on Google Maps, Hansel, Hansel Valley in Utah, you'll find a piece of land in between the north shore of the Great Salt Lake and the Idaho border that used to be the bottom of Lake Bonneville. You'll see a land, and forgive me for saying this, that would be considered perhaps wasteland. Farmers have a hard time farming it. You're 45 minutes away from pavement. The only thing going through it is a pipeline, and it's a gas pipeline that they wanted to use to generate the power. So it's a piece of property that is nothing like the pictures, but it's also not covering the entire acreage. And so maybe some of you are asking yourself, well, then why do they need that much acreage? Well, part of the project involves the federal government and wants to be used in defense. And those types of opportunities are enhanced by having some protection. And so if we're isolated in a rural part of Utah and have a boundary around us that gives us at least some protection against what we would consider as evil, then that is an advantage. And so what they were or are planning to do with that is leave it for open space, for habitat and some other things. So it's not covering 41,200 acres. It's not destroying alpine forest. And in fact, it is something that is necessary from the standpoint of protection. I know data centers have that stigma from the naysayers that say that it's Big Brother spying on us and we don't need them to do that. Let's hope I remember to get into that when we leave. But the fact is if we don't prepare on the other side for that from those that would want to do us harm, say communist China or communist Russia, or you just pick it. They're doing all they can to advance with technology, including AI, and it isn't to do good necessarily to our way of living, because I would say they don't like the fact that we're doing as well as we are as a society and the envy of the world. So real estate, power, well, I'll get into power. We've covered real estate, water, heat. Let's get into power. In those data centers a decade or more ago, for every kilowatt that was used for compute power, you needed about another kilowatt of power to operate the facility housing the compute power, which is storage and then the computer doing the research. So 1 kilowatt for each, 2 kilowatts. Today's technology, for every kilowatt used for compute power, we need about 0.09. So let's say 10% of the power needed to operate that facility. So we've improved that dramatically. But what has also happened in that time is the power of the computer chip has increased. So what we're doing is we're actually getting more capacity in the data center using less power, and then have the other efficiencies that I'm talking about in relation to the water use, etc. That power is a lot, and many are shocked at the amount of power. My 200 megawatt data center is nearly 4 times the amount of power that is needed in all of Wasatch County by Heber Light and Power. I learned the other day that Fillmore uses about 5 megawatts of power. So it's like 20 of those communities. So it's a lot of power. But Utah's legislators were wise in anticipating this was coming and knew that if that power demand were put on the utility, that there would be a very strong likelihood that our utility rates would go up and we would be frustrated and in fact angry, which we should be. So they designed legislation that said that if you generate power behind the meter at or above 100 megawatts, then you can be your own power source. You can't become a utility where you can sell that to other people, but you can generate your own power. And so that's what data centers are doing today, so that we don't frustrate the infrastructure for our personal uses, whether it be at home or at work or recreating, whatever we're doing in our everyday lives that rely here in Salt Lake on Rocky Mountain Power. So that behind the meter power generation in Utah typically is best by using natural gas. And I could get into a longer podcast, but just be aware here for these purposes that natural gas is actually in abundance, not only in Utah, but in America. We're an exporter of natural gas. And in fact, because Utah had a warm winter, we're doing everything we can to find somewhere to put the natural gas. And so having that resource available doesn't threaten what we will need as consumers in our residential lives, homes, offices, however you want to describe that. So we're using a resource that is plentiful. And there's other things that are coming on the horizon. A friend of mine is working on nuclear. That's getting close. They need to bring down the cost of that power. But when that comes to the market and is efficient enough to operate these data centers, that'll be a remarkable time where we can have that resource help us in this data center need. So we've got real estate, power, heat, water, and I don't know that I'm really missing anything. You can comment in the section below and perhaps ask some questions. I'll try to answer them, or maybe even do another video. But let me just address why a community would want a data center. And then for those that want to stay on, I'll talk about a data center and some of the things that might be beneficial for us to use in that. If you see a cut and a change here, I got really nervous that I was sitting here talking and the video wasn't going because on my Apple Watch it had gone off. So I apologize for that little splice in between. But why would a community want a data center? Well, in rural Utah, let's start there. By the way, in Salt Lake, there's data centers all over the place and we don't even know it. So we're complaining about data centers and don't even know that they're in our backyard. Harriman, Bluffdale, West Valley City, Salt Lake City, they're just all around us. So they're existing. But let's go out into the rural area, because oftentimes they're chosen because they have more land, and that gives you an opportunity to build a bigger data center. In rural Utah, some of the jobs that historically had kept families together are now gone. And let's say one of those is farming. We can name some others. The power in Millard County in the Delta area, the power plants closed down and there were 600 jobs lost to that. I hope they're able to bring that back. But in rural Utah, if you're raising a family and your children grow up and don't have a place to work that is meaningful and want to stay, they oftentimes are put in that bind where they say, well, I want to stay, but I can't. And so when we can bring any meaningful employment to these rural areas, it helps. In the 200 megawatt data center that I'm involved with, we will employ about 50 people. Those 50 people will have jobs anywhere from $70,000 to $180,000 here in Utah. They're good jobs. They're jobs that those communities would really like to have. I haven't talked about the hundreds of people that would be contractors that come out to build the facility, because they come in, make a big impact, are very helpful, but then they leave. And then the data center is operated by far fewer people. But it's those jobs that these communities want. And they're good jobs. They're in technology that is the wave of the future. If you're able to participate in the data world, the digital world, that's a big deal. And so it brings not only that employment, but the ancillary services that come with it. And then you have in that restaurants that can flourish a little bit more, the housing grows, the recreation, entertainment, you know the story on that. So you have a benefit for families to have other occupations that come to at least broaden the employment base. But in addition to that, you have tremendous tax dollars that come off of these. If you've agreed with me that they're not the environmental negative impact that the naysayers are saying, that they actually are legitimate good business, then you've got the real property tax. Yes, that's good, but it's not the major driver. You have the personal property tax, which is exceptional. When we talk about data centers, we'll talk about all the servers and the equipment that's in there, but it's an amazing amount of technology that is very expensive. So you've got that generation, then the wages, etc. But what happens is that in these small areas that not only haven't had employment, they will now have a tax base that they've struggled with over the years, some pretty dramatically, that is pretty exceptional, that they'll be able to put into the roads, new parks, schools, lower property tax for the residential properties, and do some things that are pretty significant for these small communities. So if I were in rural Utah and had an opportunity for a data center, I'd be looking for somebody to come in and build one in the area. Why does Utah need so many? It isn't just Utah, but a data center is storing our critical information. And we could call our personal photos and things like that sacred and personal, but think about our medical records, our banking records, our financial records, just anything that we have that is digital and how that's stored. It's typical that it's stored in 2 data centers because you need to have the security that if one goes down, that the other one can still operate. But the reason they're geographic is 2 things. One, if you're building a hurricane area, an earthquake area, an area that tends to have fires, you pick it. Any natural disaster that takes out a data center, if you have the redundancy in a couple properties, then one goes down, you're still operating and you still have the data. Critical data is actually in 3 data centers, but most of our information is stored in 2. If one goes down, they can get that backed up in somewhere else and still have 2. But if it's only in one and that goes down, all that information's lost. And again, for 3, it'd take 2 to go down, you still have the 3rd, but you keep saving that data in different places. So we need to be cognizant of geographical areas for natural disasters. But besides that, we're a little bit anxious on the latency. Latency means the speed in which data gets to us. And so if we can have something closer to us, not simple uses like our everyday text, emails, and those kinds of things, but the deeper, more sophisticated data use, latency becomes an issue. So you need that in close proximity. Utah happens to be in close proximity. We have the inland port, because we're in the middle of everything. So proximity is good. We've been a friendly business climate. We're a place people want to live. We have in-migration. So Utah just is naturally one of those places that is attractive to have data centers in. And it makes sense if you at least understand them, that it'd be an industry that we'd support and want to go after, particularly because the technology is advancing even further that will keep those protections even getting greater. So let's talk for the last couple minutes about why a data center. If you streamed a movie last night, if you listened to a podcast this morning, if you sent an email, a text, if you FaceTimed family, if you scrolled through social media, if you used maps to get yourself to a location, name anything, went online to do web searches, did online banking, checked your medical records, anything you do digitally goes through a data center. Data centers are our everyday life. And like my grandmother from earlier who read by candle, I don't think she'd go back to a candle after she had a light bulb. We're spoiled. Data is our life, and it would be very difficult for us to give it up. In fact, I don't know anyone that would. Data is being used as we're making this video here today, and you're watching it and making comments and learning and maybe even criticizing me, whatever. But data is something that we need every day. And our consumption of that data gets deeper. What was once for 1080, video watching, streaming, became 4K, so 4 times as much data. And then when we go to 8K, another 2 times, then 16K, another 2 times. But think of our photos and the things that we save and want to do, it just consumes more and more data. And we perhaps are outpacing or at least keeping up with the pace, if you're familiar with Moore's Law, with how that growth in the computer chip's ability is going. So we absolutely need a data center. There's different types of data centers. There's the hyperscalers, which is the Googles, the Metas, the Amazon, the consumers of broad-based information that we go back and forth in between, is storing our data, feeding its algorithms. That's a hyperscaler. We have enterprise, which is a data center that is generally just for one business. It'd be like here in Utah, let's say Mountain America Credit Union, let's say Intermountain Health. You can pick it, but you have the hyperscalers, you have the enterprise, you have facilities that are called co-locators. In a co-location building, it would be somebody who's built a data center and leases a certain amount of space to the smaller data center users. And so small companies can go in a co-location, a little bit bigger can do enterprise, and then the big ones that where we're consuming a great deal of information and data, where AI resides, et cetera, is in those hyperscaler data centers. And then we have what is called an edge data center, which is in closer proximity to us. And what happens when we stream a movie, for example, it'll go out and get 10 to 12 seconds of video information and send to us. That when you're buffering, when you see that spinning, you're actually receiving that piece of information, and the data center is saying what capacity does that server have, and then will give us, if we're asking for it in 4K and they have 4K, it'll give it to us in 4K. But if we only can take 1080, it'll drop it down. But that edge server is taking those bits of information and feeding them back and forth to us personally, and that data center stores the movie. So those edge servers are data centers as well. So we have the different types of data centers. We know what their use is, and then just very quickly to explain to you what a data center is. If you've ever seen servers, I would describe them, if you haven't seen servers, it's a bank of computers with all the fancy lights going on and off. But if you haven't seen them, maybe a higher end sound studio system with the video and audio components, where you have the amplifiers and those components. So you just think of racks of servers in long halls. And what happens in those data centers, that's what they are, is it's just long halls of servers, of computers that are operating, getting the information. You have storage cards that are taking the storage and just holding it until we want it. You have a CPU, and the CPU is let me explain it like it's us. So your storage would be your brain, which is your memory, and you'd have that in, say, about 10 to 15% of the data center space. And then your thinking is the CPU that can do a couple tasks at the same time. So it's going in and finding that memory and then using it in some kind of a task. So the CPU is doing, another 15% of the workload in that storage and memory or thinking. And then the last is a GPU. And what the GPU would be, if we're thinking about our bodies again, is that the storage is our memory, the CPU is our thinking. The GPU would actually be like my hands and us being able to do multitask. So it's actually the graphic, and it's going out and doing the multitask. If in the past on my single computer, I would go in and want to travel to Zion, Utah, I would go in and I'd search hotels, and I'd search routes, and I'd search entertainment, I'd search trails and parks, I'd get tickets, I'd plan my trip. And let's say in that I did quite a few engine searches, search engine inquiries, and put together my data. An AI, which is the heavy user of that bigger percent, the GPU, will go in there and act like my computer search all at once. So I'm on one computer, it'll go in and do 50 computer searches in a millisecond, use quite a bit of compute power on the GPU, and then give me my information. It can be as simple as me saying, I want to go to Zion Park. It'll give me the best time to go, what to do, and give it to me very quickly. And so it's like it took me doing that long search, condensed it down into one, and gave me the information all at once. My personal computer would be like my car. I'll drive it to work and it sits there while I'm at work, and I drive it home. Or if I drive it to the store, I drive it to the movie. So I use it, but I use it infrequently. And the data center would be like a bus or a long haul truck that's designed to be used all the time, and it has a lot of passengers. So a data center is heavy traffic, used all the time, doesn't get tired, but it's extraordinarily efficient. So a data center is something that is pretty amazing, and the technology that we're generating out of artificial intelligence is actually making the data centers better used. So while it's on this trajectory of demand need, a hockey stick need, the data center's AI is actually figuring out how to operate more efficiently. And as it builds that efficiency, we'll get better and better, and we'll be able to tolerate more and more information. So I hope this video has been helpful. I'll do my best to look in the comments and see if there's anything in there that I need to answer. I'll take the criticism. I know it'll come. That old man, no eyebrows, all that. I've heard it, seen it. I've run for political office. I can take the heat, and I can take the hate from those that actually want to continue to fearmonger. What I'd propose that you do, if you've made it this far, is that anytime you have a question, just push pause and go do your own search and see if what I'm telling you is in fact the truth. I'm not afraid of that. I haven't spoken to anything that I don't know about, and in fact is something that I hope is new information to people, and that there's some of you that have come on board with the idea of wanting data centers in your area and looking forward to the day where this technology continues to make our lives better. Thank you for your time.